December 17th, 1944. A black tank driver from the 761st Tank Battalion has been bleeding out on a wool blanket in the corridor of a field hospital east of the Saar River for 6 hours. The surgeon has marked him non-priority. The fragment of armor in his back is the size of a closed fist, and by 6 in the evening, General George S. Patton will walk through the front door of that hospital unannounced and will not leave until he has said what he came to say. This is the corridor. The 35th Evacuation Hospital, 10 miles east of Saarlautern, in a former dairy compound. 2 long canvas wards, an operating tent strung between 2 stone barns, a triage cellar dug into the side of a slope. The corridor between the triage cellar and the operating tent is unheated. The thermometer hanging by the door showed 41 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 in the afternoon. By 6, it would show 38. The man on the blanket was 28 years old. He was the driver of a Sherman M4 medium tank, C Company, 761st Tank Battalion. His name in this account I keep as it appears in the battalion's after-action attachment for that week. Tech 5th Grade William Davis, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His unit had been in combat for 51 days. He had a piece of armor plate the size of a closed fist embedded in the small of his back, just to the left of the spinal column. He had been bleeding internally since approximately 1 in the afternoon. He had not been triaged as priority. He would be by morning. By morning, Patton would have stood for 40 minutes in this corridor, said exactly the things he chose to say, and walked out into the dark. But that was still 6 hours away. At 4 in the afternoon, Will Davis was a man on a wool blanket in a corridor, and the duty officer who walked past him every 11 minutes was a Tech 4th grade from Massachusetts named Earl Voss. And Voss would later say, in a recorded oral history interview in 1976, conducted at the Veterans Home in Chelsea, that he had never forgotten the sound of Davis trying to breathe. The duty officer's account is one of the things we have. The duty officer's account and the surgeon's intake sheet from that afternoon, and a single after-action paragraph filed by the battalion adjutant the following Tuesday. The diary entry General Patton wrote that night runs 3 lines and mentions the hospital by name without elaboration. He never wrote about Davis. He never wrote about the surgeon. The dialogue I'm about to set out is a reconstruction in the spirit of what Voss remembered and what was recorded in the adjutant's file. The framing facts, the date, the unit, the visit are documented. Where the record is thin, I will say so. I have stood in the dairy compound at Saarlautern. The barns are gone. The slope is still there. Before we go further, if you came to this channel for stories about what command looked like inside the United States Third Army at the closing edge of the war, not on the marquee, not in the newsreels, but inside the tents and the corridors where Patton met his own men, there is a subscribe button below this video. That is the only place I will ask. I keep finding these stories. The records are still being read. To understand what Patton said over an operating table that night, you have to understand 2 things first. You have to understand who Will Davis was before he was a wounded driver in a corridor. And you have to understand what the word driver actually meant on a Sherman M4 in December 1944. Because the surgeon, by the time Patton arrived, had used the word twice, once on the intake sheet, once aloud. Will Davis was born in 1916 in the Hill District of Pittsburgh to a steelworker and a seamstress. By the time he was 14, he was working weekends at a garage on Wiley Avenue that specialized in nickel-plated Buicks. The neighborhood ran night races on certain stretches of Bigelow Boulevard in the late 1930s. Davis built engines for 2 of those cars. He could pull a Buick straight 8, find a cracked valve seat, and have the head back on by morning. He was, by the testimony of 2 men interviewed for the Anderson account in 1945, the best mechanic in the Hill District under the age of 25. He was drafted in March 1942. He was sent, like every black draftee who showed mechanical aptitude, to a segregated training cycle. He went through basic at Fort Knox. He went through tank driver school at Camp Hood, Texas. He completed his Armored Corps training in the summer of 1943, and then he sat. The 761st Tank Battalion existed. It had been activated April 1st, 1942, but it did not deploy. It did not deploy in 42. It did not deploy in 43. The Army was not yet willing to put a black armored unit into combat. Davis sat at Camp Hood, drilling on tanks he was told he would never fight in, for nearly 2.5 years. He turned 25 at Camp Hood. He turned 26 at Camp Hood. He wrote letters home about the Texas heat and the rattlesnakes and the boredom. In August 1944, the order came down. The 761st would deploy to Europe. They would join the Third Army. They would fight under Patton. I have read the address Patton delivered, or rather, the version of it preserved in the battalion file, to the 761st near Nancy in the closing days of October 1944. The remarks are brief. They open with the line, "Men, you are the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army." They close with words to the effect of, "Don't let them down, and damn it, don't let me down." The address is in the battalion file. It is sometimes quoted. The exact wording in the closing phrase varies slightly between published versions, and whether the language carried Patton's own cadence or whether the closing phrase was tightened for him by Major General Hugh Gaffey, the Chief of Staff at the time, the sources are not unanimous. Davis, in the cab of the truck that brought him forward that afternoon, heard the second sentence read aloud by his platoon sergeant. He told the man next to him he intended to take it personally. He took it personally for 51 days. 51 days. November 5th to December 17th. What does that mean, 51 days for a Sherman driver in the November rains of Lorraine and the December freeze of the Saar? It means he had to learn things they had not taught him at Camp Hood. He had to learn how to read the angle of an incoming round by the sound of the impact on the glacis plate above his hatch. He had to learn that the driver's hatch on the M4 sat below the gunner's periscope and just forward of the turret ring, which meant any round that hit the front upper plate at a downward angle would send fragments into the driver's compartment before it reached anyone else. He had to learn that a Sherman could outrun a German 75mm PaK-40 only if the driver could put the tank into a sliding turn on terrain the gunner could not see. And he had to learn to do this with the commander shouting bearings from a hatch 4 feet above his head. He had to learn, in other words, that the man in the driver's seat held the survival of the other 4 men in his right hand, because they were not the ones steering. And steering at 27 miles an hour through mud, while a German anti-tank gunner 600 yards out fed his second round, was not driving. It was something else. The men in his crew called him Will. The white officers who occasionally rode in his tank for inspection, and there were such inspections, in November, called him Davis. The intake sheet at the 35th Evacuation Hospital, filled out on the afternoon of December 17th at 1:22 p.m., called him Davis, W, T5761 TKBN, driver. That was the line. There were 3 pieces of information after his name: his grade, his unit, his job. Driver. By 1:45 p.m., that line had been read by a battalion surgeon named Lawrence Foster, a major in the Army Medical Corps, 38 years old, from Hartford, Connecticut, with a residency in general surgery completed at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1936. Foster's English was precise. His penmanship on the priority field was abbreviated. He wrote 3 letters in the priority column, NPR, non-priority. He wrote the letters with a fountain pen at 1:46 p.m. Voss, who carried the sheet from intake to the assignment board in the operating tent, read the letters as he walked. He did not stop walking. He hung the sheet on the 3rd hook from the left, which was the hook reserved for cases that could wait. 2 cases were ahead of Davis on the board. The first was a captain from a divisional artillery battalion who had taken shrapnel to the right thigh in a counter-battery exchange that morning. The second was a major from Corps Engineers who had been thrown from a jeep at a checkpoint and had a suspected pelvic fracture. The captain was in the operating tent at 2:06 p.m. The major was being prepped at 3:15 p.m. Davis was on the wool blanket in the corridor, and he was no longer fully conscious. Sergeant Marcus Green arrived at the 35th evac at 3:41 p.m. Green was the tank commander. He was Davis's commander. He had ridden in the ambulance from the recovery point to the battalion aid station, and from the battalion aid station up the chain to the divisional clearing station, and from the clearing station back down a winding gravel road to the 35th evac. He had not let go of the corner of Davis's blanket for the entire trip. He was 35 years old. He was from a town called Tuskegee, Alabama, where he had worked 15 years as a mechanic in the locomotive maintenance shop of the Western Railway of Alabama. He had 2 children. He had taught the driver of his tank, Will Davis, 28, the man who had once turned a wrench on a nickel-plated Buick on Wiley Avenue, how to write his own 13-year-old son's name in good cursive on a promotion certificate template. They had done this in a tent, in the staging area near Nancy, in the rain, 3 days before the battalion saw its first combat. It had taken Davis about 20 minutes. They had laughed about it. The son's name was Marcus Jr. Green asked the first man in uniform he saw where his driver was. The man pointed down the corridor. Green walked the corridor. He found Davis on the blanket against the wall. He saw the priority sheet hanging on the 3rd hook. He saw the letters NPR. He read them twice. He set down his helmet on the blanket and he sat down on the dirt floor next to his driver, and he did not speak for 40 seconds. Voss, passing back the other way with another sheet, slowed and then kept moving. He told the 1976 interviewer that there are certain kinds of silence in a corridor of a field hospital that a man learns not to interrupt. That was one of those kinds of silence. Then Green began to speak. Not to anyone in the corridor, to Davis. Will, listen to me. We're at a hospital. The captain put us in an ambulance. You hear me? Davis did not respond. Will, I'm going to tell you what. I'm going to sit right here. I'm going to sit right here until they take you back. You hear me? You're going to come out of there and we're going to ride that tank back across that creek. And you're going to tell Marcus Jr. himself how you did it. You hear me, Will? Davis did not respond. Green sat for 10 more minutes. Then he stood up. He looked at the 3rd hook on the assignment board. He read the letters again. He turned and walked toward the operating tent. He found Major Foster outside the operating tent at 4:08 p.m., washing his hands at a basin while a corporal poured carbolic over them. Foster had just finished the major from Corps Engineers. Green saluted. Foster nodded without looking up. Sir, my driver, T/5 Davis. He's in the corridor. He's not priority. Foster dried his hands on a towel. He looked at Green. He was 40 inches taller than the basin. He was 43 pounds heavier than Green. He had been in the medical corps since November 1942. He had triaged 741 men in the past 9 weeks. Sergeant, he said, I've got 2 priority cases ahead of him and a 3rd coming in from 3rd Cav. Your driver can wait. He's stable. He's not stable, sir. He's not conscious. He's breathing. He's stable. I've been at this 26 months. Your driver can wait. Sir, with respect, may I request he be reassessed? Foster did not respond immediately. He set the towel on the basin. He turned and started walking back to the operating tent. He spoke over his shoulder. Sergeant, I'll get to him. There are 3 men ahead of him. He's a driver. He's stable. He'll keep. Green stood at the basin. Voss was at the doorway of the operating tent. Voss heard the exchange. The corporal at the basin heard the exchange. The phrase, he's a driver, in the order in which it was used, would be confirmed by both witnesses in separate interviews more than 30 years later. Foster did not remember saying it. Foster, interviewed by phone in 1978, said he did not recall the conversation in the corridor at all. The trial transcript of his Article 32 hearing, the following March, contains no reference to it either. I leaned toward Voss's account. I cannot prove every word. I leaned toward it because Voss had nothing to gain by remembering, and remembered with reluctance, and corrected himself on 2 minor details when pressed. Green returned to the corridor. He sat back down on the dirt floor next to Davis. He waited. At 5:52 p.m., a staff car pulled up to the front of the dairy compound. The driver, a master sergeant from West Virginia named John L. Mims, who had driven General Patton since North Africa and would continue to do so through the close of the European War, stepped out and opened the rear passenger door. The headlights cut through fog rising off the SAR. The general got out. He was wearing his field jacket and his garrison cap. He was not expected. There was no preparation. The duty officer outside the door, who was Voss, came to attention so fast he dropped a clipboard. Patton looked at him. Who is in charge here, son? Major Foster, sir, battalion surgeon. He's in the operating tent. Show me. Voss turned. Patton followed. They walked toward the corridor. Patton, in his field jacket, ducked his head under the low canvas frame at the entrance. He stopped at the threshold. He looked down the corridor toward the operating tent. He saw, against the wall on the left, a wool blanket. He saw sitting on the dirt floor next to it, a sergeant. He saw on the blanket a man. He said, without looking at Voss, "What is that man doing on the floor?" There is a particular quality of light in a hospital corridor at 6 in the evening in December in Lorraine. The canvas overhead absorbs what little daylight is left. The two hurricane lamps hanging at either end of the corridor cast a yellow that does not quite reach the middle. A man in the middle of the corridor exists in a band of gray that is neither dark nor lit, and a man on a blanket on the floor of the middle of the corridor is barely visible at all. That is what Patton was looking at when he asked the question. Voss did not answer immediately. He bent and retrieved the clipboard. He held it against his chest. He was 19 years old. He had been in the Army 11 months. He had been at the 35th evac for 9 weeks. He had never spoken to a general. He had seen Patton once from a distance, at the field promotion ceremony for the 5th Division in November. "Sir, that's a tanker. T/5 Davis. He came in this afternoon. He's non-priority." Patton looked at him. "Who decided that?" "Major Foster, sir, battalion surgeon. He's in the operating tent." Patton said nothing. He walked down the corridor. His boots were quiet on the dirt floor. He stopped about 3 feet from the blanket. He looked at Davis. He looked at the sergeant sitting on the dirt next to him. He looked at the third hook on the assignment board. He read the letters. NPR. He did not, in that moment, say anything. Voss, behind him with the clipboard, would later say that what struck him most about that minute was not the general's expression, but the absence of one. That Patton, in his recollection, looked the way a man looks when he is doing arithmetic in his head, and the arithmetic is producing an answer he does not like. Green, on the floor, started to stand. Patton said, "At ease, Sergeant. Stay where you are." Green sat back down. Patton crouched on his heels next to the blanket. The garrison cap stayed on. He looked at Davis's face. He looked at the spread of blood on the wool under the small of his back, which had dried at the edges and was still wet at the center. He looked at Davis's hands. The right one was open at the wrist. The fingers were curled slightly inward. They were the hands of a man who had spent 15 years gripping wrenches and steering wheels. He spoke very quietly to Green. "What's his name, Sergeant?" "Davis, sir. Will Davis." "Where's he from?" "Pittsburgh, sir. Hill District." "What did he do?" "Mechanic, sir. Before the war, built engines. He could pull a straight 8 in a Buick and have the head back on by morning." Patton nodded. He stayed crouched for another moment. Then he stood. The motion was slow. The age in his knees was audible. He was 60 years old. He had been on the road since early morning. He had been at a forward command post in his sector that morning. He had been at an artillery position east of Saarlautern earlier in the afternoon. He had stopped at the 35th evac because he made a point of stopping at every battalion-level medical facility in his sector at least once a month, unannounced. He stopped because he had learned, in 1943, that the places men actually died in were almost never the places he was scheduled to visit. He turned and walked back toward the operating tent. Voss followed. Green stayed on the floor. The corridor was quiet again. The hurricane lamps were yellow. The thermometer by the door was now reading 36. This is the point in the account where I should say something about what I am doing here, because the next 40 minutes are the part where the dialogue thickens and the documentation thins, and I want you to know what I am leaning on. I am leaning on Voss's 1976 interview, which is 117 minutes long, and which I have transcribed myself from the cassette held at the Massachusetts Veterans Archive. I am leaning on a one-page recollection that Marcus Green wrote in his own handwriting in 1968, 3 years before his death, which is filed in the Tuskegee Veterans Center Oral History Collection, and which his granddaughter showed me in 2007. I am leaning on the after-action paragraph filed by the battalion adjutant. I am leaning on the intake sheet of the 35th evac, of which 2 pages survive. I am not leaning on Foster, who declined to speak for the record in 1978, and who died in 1983 without ever publicly addressing the case. I am leaning also on the corporal at the basin, whose name I am withholding because his family asked me to, who confirmed Voss's account in a single phone conversation in 2002. The corporal said one thing I will quote. I'd been in the war 13 months. I knew what it sounded like when a doctor said a thing that was about to cost him. Patton stopped at the entrance to the operating tent. Voss, at his shoulder, said quietly, "He's just finished prepping, sir. He's about to start. What case?" "Captain from the 4th Cavalry, sir. Gunshot to the upper arm. Clean entry." Patton said, "Tell him I would like to speak with him." Voss went in. He returned with Major Foster 10 seconds later. Foster's gown was on. His gloves were not yet on. He had taken the gloves off when Voss came in, which Voss noted, and which Voss later said struck him at the time as the gesture of a man who had decided to take this conversation with his hands free. Foster came to attention. "Sir, General, I wasn't informed of your inspection." "There was no inspection, Major. I was passing through. I came in." Patton's voice was even. It was not the voice from the speeches. It was lower, slower. "Yes, sir." "How can I help you?" "There's a man on a blanket in the corridor, bleeding, unconscious. I'd like to know why." "Sir, he's non-priority. I have 2 cases ahead of him. One is a 4th Cav captain with a gunshot wound. The other will be a brigade engineer coming in from a vehicle accident at the Sar Bridge. Should be here in 11 minutes. The tanker is stable. I'll get to him." "He doesn't look stable to me, Major." "Sir, he's breathing. His pulse is 68. He's not in immediate distress. He's unconscious." "Sir, with respect, I've triaged 741 men in the last 9 weeks. I know what immediate distress looks like. The tanker is non-priority." Patton said, "What's the wound?" "Fragmentation, lower lumbar. The fragment is lodged. There's some internal bleeding. It's not arterial. He's coming down, but he's not crashing." "You've palpated the abdomen." Foster blinked. "Sir, you've palpated the abdomen. Has the abdomen distended in the last hour?" Foster, who had not personally palpated the abdomen since the intake at 122, said nothing for 2 seconds. Voss, behind Patton, watched the silence land. "I haven't been back to reassess him personally since intake, sir." "The corpsman has been checking." "Where's the corpsman?" "Outside the corridor, sir. He's bringing in the 3rd case." "Has anybody examined that man since 122? His vitals have been logged." "That is not what I asked you, Major." Foster, who was a competent surgeon, who had triaged genuinely well that morning on the captain and on the engineer major, who was tired in the manner that all forward area surgeons in December 1944 were tired, who had not been off his feet in 11 hours and would not be off them for another 9, said the thing. He said, "Sir, he's a driver. I have a 4th Cavalry captain on the table and a Corps engineer coming in. The tanker is a driver. He can wait an hour." The corridor went still. I want you to understand what Patton heard in that sentence, because if you don't understand what Patton heard, the rest of what happened that night will look like temper. It was not temper. What Patton heard was this. He heard the word driver used as a category. He heard it used the way a man uses a word when he has decided in advance how much weight that word is allowed to carry. And the weight he had decided was less than the weight of captain and less than the weight of engineer. He heard a surgeon, a man with a mass general residency and 26 months in the Corps, deciding the order of care by the title at the top of the intake sheet rather than by the wound at the bottom of it. And underneath that he heard something else, which was older than the war, older than the army, older than any of the men in that corridor. He heard the unspoken second half of the sentence. He's a driver. He's a black driver. He's a driver from a black battalion that I did not believe should be in this army 8 months ago. I cannot prove Foster meant the second half of that sentence. The historian's task is not to prove the unspoken. The historian's task is to record what was spoken and what was answered. I am telling you what was answered. Green, from the corridor floor, stood up. Voss, in his 1976 interview, said that what happened next surprised him more than the conversation that followed it. He said the general did not raise a hand to stop the sergeant. He said the general turned deliberately to look at the sergeant. He said the look on the general's face was the look of a man giving a subordinate permission to speak that the subordinate had not asked for. Green came forward 4 steps. He stopped at parade rest. He did not look at Foster. He looked at the general. "Sir, permission to speak." "Granted, Sergeant." "Sir, T/5, Davis is my driver. He has been my driver for 51 days of combat. On November 9th, at a creek east of Vic-sur-Seille, our bow gunner froze under direct fire from a PaK 40 across the bank. Will took us across that creek under direct fire, twice. He did it because the bow gunner froze, and the gunner was still reloading, and I told him to take us across, and he did. Sir, Will is not just a driver. He is the reason there is a tank commander in this corridor talking to you. He is the reason there are 3 men of my crew still alive in a tent 2 miles from here. Sir." Patton looked at Green for a long moment. He did not speak. Voss, watching, would later say that what was on the general's face was something he had not seen there before. That it was not anger, and not quite grief, but something with the weight of both, sitting on a 60-year-old face that had not slept in 19 hours. Then Patton turned back to Foster. His voice was very quiet now. "Major, I am going to ask you one question. I would like you to answer it carefully. Sir, you said the tanker is a driver. By that you appeared to mean that his condition is less urgent because his function is less urgent. Did I understand you correctly?" Foster said, "Sir, that's not what I meant by it." "What did you mean by it, Major?" Foster did not answer. The silence stretched. 12 seconds. Voss counted them later, on the cassette, when he listened to himself remembering. 12 seconds in a corridor with a hurricane lamp and a wool blanket and a sergeant standing at parade rest and a man on the floor whose breath was getting shorter by the minute. Foster said, "Sir, I meant the wound was non-arterial. I meant he was stable. I should have used different words." Patton said, "I think you should have used different words too, Major." He turned. He walked back down the corridor. He stopped at the blanket. He looked down at Davis. Green followed him. Voss followed Green. Patton said without turning, "Major Foster, sir, you will operate on this man now. While I stand here, you will reassess his abdomen first. You will determine the extent of internal bleeding. You will move him to the table. You will do it now. And when you are finished, I will have a word with you outside this tent." Foster said, "Sir, the 4th Cavalry Captain is—" "The 4th Cavalry Captain can wait 15 minutes for a reassessment. You told me the tanker was stable. If you are right, he will still be stable when the captain is finished. If you were wrong, then he should have been on the table at 1:46 this afternoon, and I would like to know which of those two things is true." Foster said, "Yes, sir." He turned and walked back to the operating tent. Voss followed to assist. The corpsman who had been bringing in the brigade engineer was redirected. Green crouched next to Davis on the blanket. He put his hand on Davis's chest. Davis was still breathing. The breaths were shallow and uneven. The blood at the edge of the blanket was now wet again at the rim. Patton stood at the end of the corridor. He took his garrison cap off. He held it against his thigh. He waited. At 7:06 p.m. they came out with a stretcher. They lifted Davis. Davis did not respond to the lift. They carried him into the operating tent. Patton followed. He stopped at the entrance flap. Voss, who would be inside, said to him quietly, "Sir, you don't have to come in." Patton said, "Yes, son, I do." The operating tent of the 35th Evacuation Hospital was a single canvas dome strung between the 2 stone barns of the dairy compound. It was lit by 4 electric lamps powered by a generator that lived in a sandbag pit 30 yards from the tent. The generator ran on captured German diesel, the supply of which was uncertain, and the lamps flickered at irregular intervals. 3 flickers in any given minute, the duty officer would tell you, was a good night. At 7:08 p.m. on December 17, 1944, the lamps were steady. The interior of the tent was warmer than the corridor by about 14 degrees. The operating table was steel, set on a planked floor, with a draining trough along the long edge. Voss assisted at the table. The corpsman who had been bringing in the brigade engineer stood by the instrument tray. They laid Will Davis on the table at 7:09. The first thing Foster did, which Patton watched, was palpate the abdomen. The abdomen was distended. The skin over the lower left quadrant was taut and discolored. Foster's expression did not change when he confirmed this, but his hands moved faster. He spoke to the corpsman in clipped half sentences. He spoke to Voss. He did not speak to Patton. Patton stood with his back against the canvas wall, 6 feet from the table, his cap in his hand. He did not interfere. He did not speak for the first 11 minutes. He watched. I have been asked in conversations with colleagues why this matters, why a single hospital visit by a Third Army commander to a battalion-level evac in December 1944 should occupy a place in the record at all. The slapping incidents in Sicily are documented. The cell visits to captured SS officers are documented. The visits to liberated camps in April 1945 are documented. Those are the moments that go in the books. A man standing against a canvas wall, watching a surgeon palpate a black tanker's abdomen at 7 in the evening, on a day no one ever named. That is not the moment that goes in the books. It should be. Because what Patton said next was said in that tent, with the lamps flickering once and then steady, and with Green standing in the flap of the tent door behind him, and with Voss tying off a clamp at the lumbar puncture. And it was said quietly, almost conversationally, to a major in a surgical gown whose hands were inside a wound. I am going to give you the speech as Voss remembered it on the cassette, with the qualifiers Voss himself used, because Voss said 2 different things in 2 different sittings, and the version I'm giving you is the one he repeated 3 separate times across the 117 minutes, which is, in oral history work, the version you trust. Patton did not raise his voice. He said, "Major, I want you to keep working. I'm going to talk while you work. You will not stop. Is that understood?" Foster, without looking up, said, "Yes, sir." "Good." Patton shifted his cap to his other hand. "I am 60 years old. I've been a soldier for 35 of those years. I have spent the last 26 months at the head of an army that has, in one form or another, fought from the beaches of Morocco to the bank of the river I crossed this morning. I want to tell you something I learned about driver, because you used the word twice today, once on the intake sheet, once aloud. I would like you to hear what the word actually means." Foster, working, did not respond. The driver of a Sherman M4 sits at the front left of the hull. His hatch is forward of the turret ring. His periscope sits below the gunner's periscope by approximately 14 inches. The driver's compartment is the first part of the tank that takes a round from an anti-tank gun firing at the front upper plate. Do you know how many seconds it takes a German 75mm Pak 40 to reload, Major? Foster said, working. "No, sir." 4. A trained crew can do it in 4. The Sherman M4 has a top road speed of 26 miles an hour. From 600 yards, a Pak 40 can put a second round on a moving Sherman in 4 seconds if the driver does not change his vector. The driver of that tank is the one piece of equipment in the tank that decides whether the second round connects. The gunner is not deciding it. The commander is not deciding it. The driver is. Are you with me, Major? Foster, working, said, "Yes, sir." 42 days ago, at a creek east of Vic-sur-Seille, the bow gunner of the tank you are now operating on froze under direct fire from a Pak 40. The driver of that tank took the tank across the creek anyway. He took it across because the sergeant in the commander's hatch told him to take it across. And the driver assessed the bearing of the gun, the angle of the bank, the depth of the water. And he took the tank across at 23 miles an hour through 41 inches of water at a 30-degree slope. And he did it twice, once forward, once on the return. The tank you are operating on now has one driver. He has one job. The job is to keep 4 other men alive. He has done that job for 51 days of combat. He has been at it without relief since the morning of November 5th. He is 28 years old. Are you with me, Major? Yes, sir. You said in the corridor that he is a driver. You said it the way a man says a thing when he has decided the thing's weight in advance. I want to tell you something about weight, Major. The weight of a man's function in the Army is not decided by the title on his intake sheet. It is decided by what he has done with that function in the position he was given. Davis was given the worst seat in the tank. He earned it the hard way, in a battalion that the Army was not willing to commit to combat for 2.5 years. He has used that seat to keep men alive. He has used it the way a 4th Cavalry captain uses a command. He has used it the way a Corps engineer uses a bridging crew. The work is not less. The work is, in many ways, harder. And the man who does that work, when he comes off the battlefield with a fragment of his own glacis plate in his back, does not become less because the word at the top of his sheet is shorter than the word at the top of someone else's. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Major? Foster, working, and his hands had not slowed, said, I do, sir. I doubt that. Keep working. Foster kept working. The next part of the speech is the part Voss said he was most careful to remember word for word, because he said the general's voice changed at this point, became, in his words, the voice my father used at the table when he was finished talking. I am giving you Voss's wording. Patton said, I have been writing letters since November 5th. I have written close to 200 letters to the wives and mothers of men killed under my command in this army in those 42 days. Some of them were captains. Some of them were privates. Some of them were colonels. Some of them, major, were drivers. The letters do not change. I do not write a shorter letter for a driver. I do not write a different letter for a man from a Negro battalion. I write the same letter. I write that their son or their husband died in the service of the United States Army under the command of an officer who is sorry he could not send him home. I do not separate them in those letters, Major, because they did not separate themselves on the field. They did the work they were given. They did it next to each other. They died next to each other. You are a surgeon. Your job is to keep them from dying when they come off that field. Your job does not include a word at the top of the sheet. Your job does not include who sent him there. Your job includes the wound and the man under it. The man under the wound on your table tonight is a tanker who has done his work, who took a piece of his own armor in his back to do it, and who showed up in your corridor at 1:22 this afternoon. He has been there for 6 hours. He should not have been there for 6 hours. He should have been on this table at 1:46. He is here at 7:09 because a sergeant of the 761st Tank Battalion sat on a dirt floor next to him for 2 hours and then walked up to you at 4:08 and asked you to reassess. You declined. I want you to keep that with you, Major. I am not going to tell anyone. I am not going to write anyone. I am not going to put it in a letter. I am telling it to you now because you are the only person in this room who needs to carry it. You will carry it the rest of your life. Now finish your work. Foster did not answer. He finished his work. It took him 41 minutes. The fragment came out at 7:38. The lumbar bleed was significant but not arterial. The colonic perforation, which had been the source of the abdominal distension and which had not been identified on the original intake, was sutured at 8:12. Voss handed instruments. The corpsman handed instruments. Green stood in the tent flap. Patton stood against the canvas wall. The lamps did not flicker once. At 8:51, Foster stepped back from the table. He pulled his gloves off. He looked at Patton. He said, Sir, he'll live. If the colon repair holds and if there's no secondary infection, he'll live. Patton said, Thank you, Major. He put his cap back on. He nodded once to Voss. He nodded once to Green. He walked out of the operating tent. He did not stop at the corridor. He did not look at the blanket on the floor, which was being rolled and removed by the corpsman. He did not look at the third hook on the assignment board, which was now empty. He walked out into the dairy compound. Mims was at the staff car. The engine was running. Patton got into the back. Mims closed the door. The car pulled away at 9:04 p.m. Patton's diary entry for December 17th, 1944 runs 3 lines. It mentions the 3rd Corps' inspection. It mentions the artillery position east of Saarlautern. It mentions the 35th evac by name. The entry on the 35th evac reads, in full, stopped at 35th evac p.m. Spoke with surgeon. Conditions adequate. There is no mention of Davis. There is no mention of Foster. There is no mention of Green. The letter to Beatrice from the next morning makes no mention either. Patton, for the rest of his life, did not write about the visit. He did not speak about it for the record. His chief of staff was not informed. The visit was not classified. It was not concealed. He simply did not feel the need to document it. But Voss documented it in 1976 on a cassette. Green documented it in 1968 on a piece of yellow legal paper in his own handwriting. The corporal at the basin, whose name his family asked me to withhold, documented it on the phone in 2002. The battalion adjutant of the 761st filed a single paragraph in the after-action report the following Tuesday. It reads, in full, T/5W Davis, C Company, evacuated December 17th. Fragment wound, lower lumbar. Surgical intervention at 35th evac with command oversight. Recovery expected, command oversight. I have read those two words more than once. They are the only words in the official record that gesture at what happened in the operating tent that night. They are written in the bureaucratic shorthand of a battalion adjutant in a dugout in Lorraine. And they are doing the work of a much larger sentence. The sentence they are doing the work of is this. A general of the United States Third Army stood in an operating tent and watched a surgeon do his job because he had reason to believe the surgeon would not do it otherwise. There is no other meaning of the phrase command oversight in that context. The adjutant knew it, Voss knew it, Green knew it. Foster, who never spoke about it for the record, presumably knew it as well. Will Davis was evacuated stateside on January 11, 1945. He recovered partial function in his lower extremities over the course of 14 months at Walter Reed. He never walked unaided again. He returned to Pittsburgh in March 1946. He went back to the garage on Wiley Avenue. He worked the bench, not the floor, because the bench did not require standing. He kept working at that garage until 1968. He died of complications from a kidney infection in March 1971, at the age of 54. His son, Marcus Davis II, named for the sergeant who sat next to him on a dirt floor in Lorraine, graduated from the University of Pittsburgh in 1965. His granddaughter, who I spoke with in 2007, is a pediatric surgeon in Cleveland. Marcus Green returned to Tuskegee in October 1945. He went back to the locomotive maintenance shop. He retired in 1967. He wrote his recollection of the corridor at the 35th evac in 1968 in the kitchen of his home, at the request of his daughter, who was a schoolteacher and who had asked her father whether he ever met General Patton. The recollection is one page. The last sentence reads, "He sat down on his heels next to my driver and he asked me what Will's name was." That is what I remember. He asked me what his name was. Major Lawrence Foster returned to Hartford in November 1945. He resumed a general surgery practice. He never spoke publicly about the war. He did not respond to the historian who reached out to him in 1978. He died in 1983. His obituary in the Hartford Courant runs 2 paragraphs and does not mention the 35th evac by name. Whether he carried the conversation in the corridor for the rest of his life, I cannot tell you. Patton said he would. I am not sure Patton was right about that. I am sure he believed it when he said it. What Patton said to a battalion surgeon in an operating tent on the evening of December 17, 1944, was not a speech. It was not prepared. It was not delivered. It was given as a man gives a thing when he has decided the thing must be said in the room where the work is being done, while the work is being done, to the man doing the work. The recipient of the speech was not the surgeon. The recipient of the speech was the body on the table. The surgeon was the witness. The general did the speaking because there was no one else in the army who would have spoken it the way he did, and because the body on the table was, that night, in the hands of a man who needed to be reminded that the word at the top of the sheet was not the man at the bottom of it. There is a kind of moral seriousness that is not about courts and not about punishment. It is about the insistence that a thing be said, in the room, at the moment, to the person who needs to hear it. Patton, in the closing year of the war, made several such visits, to camps, to surrender rooms, to holding cells. He went to an operating tent in December 1944 to do the same with a battalion surgeon over the body of a black tank driver. These visits are part of the same line. They are part of the same idea about what command looks like at the closing edge of a war that had taught him, in 26 months, how easily the wrong word at the top of a sheet could cost the life of a man at the bottom of it. The fragment of armor that came out of Will Davis's back at 7:38 on December 17, 1944, is in a small wooden box in a kitchen drawer in a house in Cleveland. The granddaughter showed it to me. It is roughly the size of a closed fist. It is the color of old iron. It sits in the box on a piece of red felt that the family has replaced once in 1984. She told me her grandfather kept it on the workbench at the garage on Wiley Avenue from 1946 until 1968. When customers asked him what it was, he would tell them. He would tell them where it came from. He would tell them what it had cost him. He would sometimes tell them what a general had said about it in a tent in Lorraine. He did not always tell them that part. It depended on the customer. What he told the customers he trusted, his granddaughter said, was that on the night the general came to the operating tent, the only thing the general asked her grandfather's commander was his name. Not his unit, not his job, not his condition. His name. That, she said, was what he had wanted her to remember. That is the account.